In January 1889, a letter arrived for a 24-year-old woman in Vienna. It was from her husband. He had written it the night before, somewhere outside the city, and by the time she read it, he was already dead. "Dear Stephanie," the letter began, "you are freed from my presence and vexation. Be happy in your fashion." The woman who received that letter was Princess Stephanie of Belgium, and the man who wrote it was Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, heir to the largest empire in continental Europe. 8 years earlier, at not quite 17, she had married him in front of the assembled royalty of the continent. She had been promised a future as Empress of Austro-Hungary, one of the most powerful titles a woman could hold. That future ended in a hunting lodge in the Vienna woods, in circumstances the imperial court spent years trying to control. What happened to Rudolf that January night became one of the most written about events in royal history. What happened to Stephanie afterward, the 8-year-old marriage that had already been failing, the daughter who would one day refuse to speak to her, the second husband she chose for herself, and the price she paid for choosing him, has been told far less often. She was raised to become an empress. She spent the rest of her very long life being defined by the one title she never got to hold. Stephanie Clotilde Louise Hermine Marie Charlotte of Belgium was born on the 21st of May 1864 at the Royal Palace of Laeken, the second daughter of King Leopold II of Belgium and Marie Henriette, Archduchess of Austria. It was not a happy household. Leopold kept mistresses throughout the marriage and showed little interest in his daughters, occupied as he was with the business ventures, including his brutal exploitation of the Congo, that would later make him one of the most reviled monarchs in European history. Marie Henriette was cold and largely absent from her children's lives. When Stephanie's only brother died of pneumonia in childhood, Leopold blamed his wife for the loss, and the marriage effectively ended in all but name. Stephanie and her sister grew up starved of the warmth that should have come naturally in a royal nursery. It left its mark. Stephanie would later be described by those who knew her as determined to find love wherever she could get it, a trait that would shape every major decision of her adult life, for better and for considerably worse. In March 1880, Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria travelled to Brussels at the invitation of King Leopold, who was determined to secure one of the most prestigious matches in Europe for his daughter. Rudolf was the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and the famously beautiful Empress Elisabeth, known as Sisi, and as heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, he was, by any measure, the most eligible prince on the continent. He met Stephanie, then 15 years old, and wrote to his mother that he had found what he sought, describing her as pretty, good, and clever. The engagement was announced to the great joy of Stephanie's parents. The wedding was delayed by several months after Stephanie's ladies-in-waiting in Vienna discovered, to general embarrassment, that she had not yet physically reached puberty. The match proceeded regardless once that obstacle had passed. They married on the 10th of May 1881 at the Augustinian Church in Vienna, a week before Stephanie's 17th birthday. The ceremony was packed with the royalty of Europe. Future kings and emperors crowded into the pews to witness the union. Stephanie remembered the bells ringing across the whole city and believed in that moment that she had stepped into the life she was meant for. It did not last. The early months held genuine warmth. Rudolf and Stephanie gave each other pet names, Coco and Kosuz, and for a brief period she believed she had found, in her own words, a model husband. In September 1883, their daughter Elizabeth was born, nicknamed Ergie, and Stephanie threw herself into her official duties, frequently standing in for the Empress Elisabeth, who preferred travel to court life and was rarely present. But the marriage Stephanie had imagined was not the one she got. Rudolf was restrictive and controlling, reportedly forbidding her from leaving the palace grounds without his permission. he was also increasingly unfaithful. His affairs were numerous enough to be an open secret at court, and at some point during these years, he contracted a sexually transmitted infection that he passed to his wife. The infection left Stephanie unable to have further children. She was 20 years old. Her relationship with her mother-in-law offered no refuge. Empress Elisabeth had never considered the Belgian monarchy, founded only in 1830, a suitable match for her son, and made little effort to disguise her contempt for her daughter-in-law. Stephanie, increasingly isolated, devout, and politically conservative, found herself growing further apart from a husband whose liberal opinions and restless temperament she did not share, and increasingly did not trust. By the late 1880s, Rudolf was a deeply unhappy man, frustrated by his lack of real political influence and estranged from a father who distrusted his liberal sympathies. In late 1888, he began a relationship with Baroness Mary Wetzera, the 17-year-old daughter of an Austrian diplomat. The affair was conducted with little discretion, and by January 1889, it had become the subject of court gossip that had not yet reached the wider public. On the night of the 29th of January, 1889, Rudolf travelled to Mayerling, his hunting lodge in the Vienna woods, with Mary Wetzera. On the morning of the 30th of January, both were found dead in the lodge, each from gunshot wounds. Rudolf was 30 years old. Mary Wetzera was 17. The Austrian court's first instinct was concealment. The official gazette in Vienna reported that the Crown Prince had died of a ruptured aneurysm. The truth emerged within days, despite the court's efforts, and Vienna and the wider world were left to make sense of an event the imperial family would spend years trying to control the narrative around. Before he died, Rudolf wrote letters. One was to his mother, one was to Stephanie. It read in part, "Dear Stephanie, you are freed from my presence and vexation. Be happy in your fashion. Be good to the poor little one, who is the only thing that remains of me." Stephanie was 24 years old when she received it. Whatever the marriage had become by that point, however far apart they had drifted, the letter is the last documented communication between two people who had once believed, even briefly, that they were stepping into a shared future together. The future she had been promised, the title of Empress that had been the entire point of the match arranged when she was 15, ended with it. Rudolf's death stripped Stephanie of any real position at the Austrian court. She was no longer the future empress. She was simply the widow of a controversial prince, dependent on the emperor's goodwill for her financial support, and treated by much of the imperial family as an inconvenient reminder of a scandal they wished to forget. Empress Elisabeth's hostility, if anything, intensified. Stephanie travelled extensively through Europe in the years that followed, in part to escape a court that had little use for her anymore. She worked on her memoirs and oversaw the completion of a major historical and cultural survey of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy that Rudolf had begun before his death, seeing it through to publication in 1902. In 1900, she did something that the Austrian court found almost as scandalous as anything Rudolf had done. She fell in love with a Hungarian nobleman, Count Elemer Lonyai, a man of considerably lower rank than anything a former crown princess was expected to consider. Her parents were furious. The Habsburg court made clear that the marriage would cost her what remained of her position within the family. She married him anyway, in January 1902, and in doing so was formally excluded from the House of Habsburg. The cost was severe and lasting. Her own daughter Elizabeth, raised largely without her after Rudolf's death, and resentful of a mother she felt had abandoned her for a man beneath their station, broke off contact almost entirely. Stephanie would go years at a time without seeing her only child. When Elizabeth later left her own unhappy marriage to a Habsburg prince to live with, and eventually marry, a socialist politician named Leopold Petzneck, Stephanie disinherited her, formalizing a rift that never properly healed. Stephanie and Lonyai settled at Orosvar Castle, an estate in what is today Slovakia, where they lived for more than 4 decades. During the First World War, Stephanie served with the Red Cross. In the years afterwards, she lived, by several accounts, an extravagant existence and lost much of her personal fortune through gambling debts and unsuccessful business ventures during the 1920s. In 1935, she attempted to publish her memoirs in Austria under the title I Was to be Empress. The Austrian government banned its distribution, unwilling to revisit the scandal of Mayerling or grant Stephanie the final word on a story the Habsburgs had spent decades trying to control. The book was eventually published outside the country and translated into several languages. She remained, for the rest of her life, a woman defined by a title she had held only on paper for 8 years and lost in a single January night. She had been raised from the age of 15 for the singular purpose of becoming Empress of Austria-Hungary. She never did. By 1944, with the Second World War closing in on Central Europe, Stephanie drew up her will. In April 1945, the advancing Red Army reached Orosvar. For the first weeks of the Soviet occupation, Stephanie and Lonyai remained at the estate with a handful of remaining servants. In May, with Stephanie now suffering from heart disease, the couple fled to the Benedictine Archabbey of Pannonhalma in Hungary, placing themselves under the protection of the International Red Cross. She died there on the 23rd of August 1945 of a stroke at the age of 81. Neither her daughter Elisabeth nor any of her grandchildren attended the funeral. She was buried in the crypt of the abbey. Elima Lonyai died less than a year later and was laid to rest beside her. She had outlived the empire she was meant to rule, the husband whose death ended that possibility in a single night, the mother-in-law who never accepted her, and very nearly the century itself. She left her remaining wealth and her personal papers to the abbey that had sheltered her in her final months, the closest thing she had left to a family that wanted her. She titled her own memoir, I Was to be Empress. It was not bitterness exactly. It was simply the truest sentence she had to write. She had been raised for that single purpose since she was 15 years old, and a letter delivered on a January morning in 1889 was the moment that purpose ended. Everything after, the second marriage chosen for love rather than dynasty, the estrangement from her own daughter, the 4 decades at a Hungarian castle, the abbey she died in, was the long, complicated remainder of a woman who had been promised one specific future and given an entirely different one instead. If her story has stayed with you, please share it. Subscribe to History Roadshow if you have not already. Thank you for watching.